The wind whispered through the high pines like an ancient spirit trying to warn the world. Jack Barrett didn't believe in signs or omens. Not anymore. But as he stood on the front steps of his remote cabin, eyes squinting against the bitter gusts, he had the unsettling feeling that nature was trying to say something. The trees had been restless for days, their tall bodies creaking and swaying as if unsure of which way to fall. The birds had vanished. Even the usual howls of wolves echoing through the valley had fallen silent. Only the wind remained. The thermometer nailed outside his door read 37 Dufour, F and dropping. The needle quivered with every gust. It was early February, but Jack had lived through 5 brutal Alaskan winters, and none of them had bitten like this. The cold didn't feel like weather. It felt like punishment. His cabin stood alone in the folds of a mountain valley, nearly 4 hours from the nearest town. There were no neighbors, no roads beyond a rough, tire-eating trail that vanished each winter. And that was exactly how Jack had wanted it 5 years ago when he fled Seattle and everything familiar. He didn't come out here chasing peace. He came running from noise, the noise of people offering condolences, the buzz of phones, the click of camera shutters at his wife's funeral, the silence she left behind when the cancer took her. Back then, this place had felt like a sanctuary. Now, on mornings like this, it felt like a cage. Inside, the cabin was a mixture of rugged utility and remnants of the life he once had. The fireplace crackled in the living room, the embers from the night before barely holding on to their glow. He moved stiffly across the wood-planked floor, bones sore from cold and age, and threw on more logs. The blaze came to life slowly, light and warmth blooming like a memory. Jack poured a mug of bitter instant coffee and walked to the window. Frost spiderwebbed across the glass, warping the view outside into a dreamlike blur. Still, he could make out the deep snowdrifts piling higher than the porch rails and the way the pine branches bowed low, heavy under the burden of ice. His cabin was modest, a single bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a storage room that had once held his photography gear. These days, the camera cases mostly sat unopened, stacked under old flannel shirts and boxes of canned food. But the walls, they were filled. Wolves leaping through snowbanks, a moose in mid-stride, an owl frozen mid-flight, and bears, lots of bears. One image in particular had hung above the mantel for years, an early morning shot of a mother grizzly wading across a river, 2 cubs clinging to her back, mist rising from the water like breath from her jaws. The photo had made the cover of Wild North magazine, back when Jack still had a name in the industry. It had been his wife's favorite. "Strong and soft," she'd said, running her fingers over the frame. "Like a good man should be." Jack turned away from the photo and sipped his coffee. The radio on the kitchen counter crackled to life with static before the weather report came through, voice trembling from the storm miles away. Blizzard warning remains in effect for the northern valleys. Expect gusts up to 80 miles per hour and temperatures plummeting to record lows tonight. Wind chills may reach -60. All residents are urged to stay indoors and conserve fuel. He switched the radio off before the voice could say, "Fatal conditions." He didn't need the reminder. That afternoon, he worked in preparation mode. He double-checked the fuel lines to his generator, reinforced the storm shutters with salvaged planks from an old shed, and brought in extra firewood. Every movement was deliberate, a ritual of survival. His father's old voice rang in his mind like it always did when things got dicey. "Nature doesn't forgive negligence, son." It hadn't been a metaphor. By the time the sun began to sink, casting purple shadows across the snow-laden peaks, Jack had done everything he could. The last thing he checked was the satellite phone. He kept it charged on the counter beside the emergency radio, his lifeline to the ranger station 30 miles away. But in weather like this, no one would be coming even if he called. He threw more wood into the fire and sat down on the threadbare couch. The storm had begun. The wind came in pulses at first, like the distant breath of some slumbering beast. Then it escalated. Snow whipped sideways across the windows, erasing the world outside. The roof groaned under the weight. Jack could feel the cold creeping in through the seams of the walls. He put on his thickest coat, even inside. It was going to be a long night. But he didn't expect that sound. It came just after midnight, cutting through the storm like a forgotten song, low, mournful, and guttural. Jack sat bolt upright. That wasn't the wind. It wasn't a branch or a falling tree. He had lived among wildlife long enough to know exactly what it was. A bear. His breath caught. That's impossible. This time of year, bears should be deep in hibernation. Jack hadn't seen tracks in over 2 months. The idea that one was awake, and so close, wasn't just strange. It was wrong. He grabbed his flashlight, its beam sharp and narrow, and moved to the frost-coated window. He aimed the light out into the snow. And there, barely visible through the white haze, were shadows moving, slow, heavy, and deliberate. Not one, not two, 3. A mother bear and 2 cubs, staggering through chest-high snow toward his cabin. Jack's breath fogged the glass. His heart began to race. "What the hell happened to you?" he whispered. The cubs pressed into their mother's sides, tiny shapes, half buried with every step. The mother's body sagged, her gait uneven. He could see it even through the snow, exhaustion, maybe injury. Their fur was glazed in ice. Their movements were sluggish. They were dying. Jack lowered the flashlight and stepped back from the window. His mind spun. Every book, every ranger warning, every ounce of survival instinct screamed the same thing. Do not open the door. Do not engage. A cornered bear is death. But his gut said something else. Something ancient and aching. He didn't know it yet. But that night would change everything. Jack stood frozen, not from the cold, but from the decision now clawing at his sense of reason. The image of the mother bear and her cubs, barely upright in the blizzard, was burned into his mind. The flashlight still dangled from his hand, beam flickering against the far wall like a heartbeat. He hadn't moved in nearly a minute. The wind outside was screaming louder now, a merciless, unrelenting roar. The kind of sound that had once made frontiersmen bury themselves in snow just to avoid the pain of hearing it. He moved away from the window slowly, as if a sudden motion might break the fragile silence inside the cabin. The fire snapped sharply in the hearth. Jack threw more wood onto it with trembling hands. Not from fear, from urgency. He didn't know what he was about to do, but he knew he couldn't waste time thinking about it too long. In this weather, those cubs wouldn't last another hour. Still, he had to be smart. Compassion was not an excuse for stupidity. Jack grabbed his old parka from the hook by the door, pulling it over his flannel layers and zipping it all the way to the neck. He rummaged through a plastic storage tub beside the couch and pulled out an emergency blanket, silver foil, crinkled, unused. Then another, and another. They wouldn't be enough, but they were something. He paused and looked around the cabin, eyes locking on the framed photo above the fireplace, the bear in the river with her cubs. He had taken that photo almost 7 years ago in Denali, crouched in the misty morning grass with a 300mm lens and a flask of coffee. His wife had been just behind him, bundled up in an orange puffer jacket, humming some old soul tune and calling him Grizzly Jack. He remembered the laugh she gave when the cubs tumbled into the water. "They're just babies," she'd said. That memory anchored him. He took a deep breath and moved toward the back of the cabin. The storage room had originally been built to hold photography gear. back when Jack thought he'd be documenting his new off-grid life. Over the years, it had evolved into more of a catch-all: tools, old photo boxes, a backup propane heater. It had its own separate entrance on the outside, and more importantly, it was insulated enough to hold warmth if he got the portable heater running. He turned on the overhead light. It buzzed for a second before casting a weak yellow glow. The room smelled of cedar and dust, and the floor was cold as stone. Jack set to work. He dragged the propane heater to the center of the room, checked the lines, and ignited it. The blue flame flickered to life, hissing faintly as warmth began to spill into the cold air. Next, he cleared a wide space near the back wall, spreading out the foil blankets on top of a few flattened, moving boxes. He added 2 heavy wool blankets on top of those. It looked crude, primitive even, but it would trap heat. Then came the harder part. He pulled on his gloves, tucked a flashlight into his coat pocket, and opened the back door to the storm. Immediately, the wind slammed into him like a living thing. He leaned into it, knees bent, one arm shielding his eyes. Snow pelted his face in sharp little knives. The beam from his flashlight barely pierced the darkness, but he could make out the mounds of fur still huddled near the porch. The mother bear had shifted slightly. She was lying with her body curved tightly around the cubs. Her breath came in slow, visible clouds. Her head lifted as Jack approached, her eyes glowing faintly in the light. She didn't growl. She didn't move to stand. She simply watched. Jack stopped a few feet from them. His voice cracked with frost as he spoke. "I have a place. Warmer than this. You can't stay out here." He didn't expect her to understand him. It didn't matter. His words weren't for comprehension. They were an offering, a tone, a frequency of peace. The cubs were barely moving. One of them was buried halfway in the snow, its head resting limply on the other's shoulder. The mother had gathered snow and pine needles around them, trying to insulate them, but it was failing. Jack knelt slowly, unzipping his coat just enough to reach the emergency blanket. He pulled it out with both hands, holding it up to show her. The metallic sheen reflected the flashlight in shimmering waves. The mother's head tilted slightly. "Not gonna hurt you," he whispered. With slow, deliberate movement, he draped the blanket over the cubs. They didn't react. Not a twitch. The mother's ears flicked once, but she didn't attack. Jack stepped back, heartbeat hammering. The moment passed without violence. He took another blanket and laid it across the porch, then backed toward the storage room door, leaving a trail of heat behind him. He opened the door wide, letting the heater's glow shine through like a golden path. The scent of warmth carried on the air. The mother didn't move. For a full minute, nothing happened. Jack stood half-frozen in the wind, willing her to understand, willing her to choose life over fear. And then she stirred. With agonizing effort, the bear lifted her body, muscles trembling beneath her fur. She nosed the cubs gently, trying to wake them. One of them made a faint, pitiful sound. The other remained still. Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. "Come on," he whispered. The bear picked up the edge of the blanket in her jaws and began to drag it across the snow, cubs and all. The process was slow, each step visibly draining her. Jack didn't move, didn't dare. She dragged them across the porch, over the laid blanket, toward the light. The wind howled louder, furious at this act of defiance. But she kept going. Finally, they reached the threshold of the storage room. The mother paused, her massive body filling the doorway. For one terrifying moment, Jack thought she might panic, might lash out in confusion or fear. But she only stood there, sniffing the heat, feeling it wrap around her like a balm. And then she entered. The cubs came with her, motionless lumps of fur and foil. She curled her body around them as the warmth began to thaw their frozen limbs. Jack, still outside in the storm, shut the door gently, Back inside the main cabin, he collapsed onto the floor in front of the fireplace, heart pounding so hard it shook his ribs. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind rage outside and the faint, incredible sound of breathing on the other side of the wall. Not human, but alive. And safe. The storm raged into the early morning with no signs of mercy. The cabin moaned under the force of the wind, as if the forest itself were pressing down on it, testing every nail, every seal. But inside the storage room, something extraordinary was happening. Life, faint, fragile but present, was holding on. Jack sat in his living room, barely moving, wrapped in a blanket, his eyes glued to the small window that looked into the back room. He had dragged a chair over, flashlight propped against the sill, its beam angled just right. Through the glass, he could see the mother bear, curled around her cubs like a dying flame shielding its final embers. Steam still rose from her coat in wisps, catching the dim yellow light like ghosts leaving her body. The cubs were completely still. He'd done all he could. Now came the hardest part, waiting. Hours passed. Jack didn't sleep. Couldn't. His mind raced with every possible outcome. What if they didn't make it? What if the mother, in desperation, turned violent? What if his makeshift sanctuary wasn't warm enough? The heater hummed like a tired heartbeat, trying its best to ward off the frigid weight pressing in from every angle. Occasionally, Jack would stand, stretch, walk to the kitchen for water or to stoke the fire, but his eyes always drifted back to the storage room. At some point during the night, he grabbed his old camera, half by instinct. The weight of it in his hands was familiar and alien all at once. He hadn't touched it since the funeral. He didn't lift it to his eye, just held it, like a relic from a life he'd left behind. By the time light began to bleed into the sky, muted and grey, Jack noticed something that stopped his breath. One of the cubs moved. It was a small twitch, barely more than a ripple in the fur, but it was unmistakable. He pressed closer to the window, squinting. The cub's leg kicked again. A moment later, the other cub stirred, its tiny snout nudging against the mother's chest. The bear didn't respond at first. Then, slowly, her head lifted. Her eyes were still glassy with exhaustion, but they blinked. Jack felt something swell in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Hope. He didn't dare go in, not yet. He didn't want to disturb whatever fragile balance was keeping the moment together. Instead, he watched as the cubs squirmed closer to their mother, each movement painfully sluggish, but growing stronger with time. The mother licked one of them weakly, tongue moving in a repetitive maternal rhythm. The act was slow, deliberate, and strangely human in its tenderness. He exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Outside, the storm hadn't relented, but Jack barely noticed now. The violent rhythm of snow and ice felt further away somehow, irrelevant. There was warmth in that back room, not just the heater, but the kind of warmth that comes from choosing compassion over fear. Jack stood and walked to the wood stove, adding more logs. The fire crackled in response, its light chasing back the shadows. He poured himself a mug of hot water. He was out of coffee and leaned against the counter. The camera sat on the table beside him. His fingers reached for it unconsciously. He lifted it, looked through the viewfinder, and framed the shot of the bears through the small interior window. He didn't take the photo. Not yet. Something in him felt like this moment wasn't about capturing, it was about witnessing. Later, he bundled up and stepped into the howling wind again to check the generator. His footsteps sank deep into the powder, and snow stung every exposed inch of his skin. The world outside was white chaos. Even the trees looked like ancient ghosts, barely visible in the blur. The generator was still running, though the line feeding to the storage room heater had ice forming along it. He cleared it carefully, fingers numbing fast. A mistake out here could cost more than time. It could cost fingers, or worse. But he managed to stabilize the setup, wrapping insulation around the worst spots. Before heading back inside, he paused and looked at the path he had carved the night before. Already, it was gone. The wind had erased it, like it never existed. As he stepped back inside, the warmth hit him like a physical embrace. He shut the door behind him and shook the snow from his coat. Back in the living room, he checked the storage room window. The mother bear's eyes were open, and they were watching him. She didn't growl, didn't move, just stared. Not with the primal wildness he'd seen through the lens 100 times in the field. This was different. Tired, wary, but not afraid. Their eyes locked for a few long seconds, and something passed between them, something ancient and unspoken. Jack had spent a lifetime capturing wildlife on film, but never once had he felt this scene. "Welcome back," he murmured. That night, Jack didn't sleep much either. He took a cot and laid it near the inner wall, not far from the storage room, keeping one ear tuned to every sound. The heater continued to purr and the storm screamed on, but inside the cabin, a strange kind of peace settled over everything. It wasn't until the second morning that the cubs began to explore the small space they now occupied. Jack watched, amazed as one stood, still wobbly, and batted at a length of rope coiled near the heater. The other rolled over, its fur now mostly dry, eyes blinking in the golden light. The mother remained mostly still, but her head tracked them with quiet attentiveness. Jack began to leave shallow bowls of water and bits of bread soaked in broth near the door. He didn't enter, just opened the inside latch a crack, slid the bowl through, and shut it again. The mother bear accepted this, watched, sniffed, then allowed her cubs to eat. Every time Jack did it, she watched with the same sharp, silent eyes. He never forgot that she was a wild creature. That trust was a gift, one that could vanish with the wrong movement, the wrong scent, the wrong breath. But still, it was trust. The storm outside raged on into its third day. The walls creaked, and snow piled higher than the windowsills. Jack knew he was lucky. If the power had failed, if the heater hadn't worked, if the mother bear had panicked, he wouldn't be alive. Neither would they. And yet, against every law of wilderness survival, 3 bears were alive in his back room, recovering, and a man who had long believed himself beyond repair was beginning, ever so slowly, to thaw. The third night came cloaked in the same silence that always followed a storm's worst moment, when the wind, like a dying tyrant, had spent its fury and now lay breathless across the mountains. Jack knew better than to trust that silence. It was often when the danger shifted from wind to cold, from noise to stillness, that death came calling. But this time, it was different. He sat by the fire, with a worn notebook on his lap, the same one he used to carry during expeditions in the Yukon years ago. The pages had once been filled with camera settings, tracking notes, and field observations. Tonight, for the first time in a long while, he'd begun writing again. But not about the environment, not about light angles or animal habits. He was writing about the cubs. The way one had pawed gently at the heater earlier that afternoon, sniffing it curiously before curling up beside it. The way the mother had let out a low, warning huff, not out of fear but protective caution, when Jack had placed a second bowl of softened oatmeal near the door. The cubs had eaten, hesitantly at first, then with urgency. They were recovering. Jack wrote it all down like it mattered. Because it did. And because part of him needed to remember that something good was still possible in a world where so much had gone wrong. The clock ticked softly on the mantel, its hands slow and deliberate. Jack reached out and touched the frame of the old bear photograph again. The mother grisly in the river, mist curling around her legs. cubs gripping her back with wet paws and eyes wide with wonder. His wife had called that photo eternal strength. She'd always believed in symbols, in moments that meant more than they appeared to. Jack used to laugh at that. He believed in shutter speeds, aperture settings, and perfect timing. Now, years later, watching this real-life mirror of that photograph survive in his storage room, he wasn't so sure anymore. He grabbed his coat, stuffed his gloves into the sleeves, and quietly walked to the rear of the cabin. The inner window still offered a view into the warm, glowing room where the Bear family now rested. The cubs lay curled against each other, while the mother remained awake, head resting between her paws, eyes half-lidded. Jack had noticed how often she watched him now, not with hostility, but like she was learning him the same way he was learning her. Tonight, he was ready to take the next step. He needed to clean the room. He cracked the door open, keeping his body low and movements slow. The warm air inside flowed outward, like breath from a sleeping animal. He stayed at the threshold, eyes locking with the mother's. She didn't move. "Hey," he said softly. "Just me. Gonna clean a bit. You okay?" He had no idea why he kept talking to her like she understood. Maybe because it made him feel less insane. Jack stepped inside, one cautious foot after the other. The cubs didn't stir. The mother didn't growl. She followed his every movement with her eyes, but that was all. Her breathing was steady. Controlled. Jack worked quickly, gathering the used towels and blankets and replacing them with clean ones. The heater hissed comfortingly, casting orange light along the wooden floor. The smell of bear musk and melted snow lingered in the room, but it wasn't unpleasant, just real, present, living. As he moved toward the door again, he felt a sharp pain shoot through his knee. Old injury. Cold always made it worse. He stumbled slightly, and for the first time, the mother bear let out a sound, not a growl, not a warning, but something lower, more uncertain. Jack froze. "I'm okay," he murmured, raising his hand instinctively. "Just old bones." She blinked. Didn't move. Jack backed out of the room slowly and closed the door. He exhaled hard as it clicked shut. His heart had climbed into his throat during those few seconds of eye contact, but not out of fear. It was awe. Back in the living room, Jack sat down and rubbed his knee. It ached sharply now, but he was smiling. He had gone into a room with a mother bear and walked out unscathed. Not because of luck, but because something wordless had passed between them, a mutual understanding carved in the cold. That night, as the fire burned low and Jack's eyes drifted shut, he dreamed of snow. Not the kind that buries and blinds, but the kind that hushes everything. In the dream, the bears were with him in the forest. They walked beside him through a grove of pines, their tracks perfectly aligned with his in the snow. He could hear his wife's voice somewhere above him, like wind through branches. "They found you," she whispered. "Now, what are you going to do?" He didn't answer. The dream ended when one of the cubs tugged playfully at his glove. Jack woke in the grey quiet of morning. The storm had passed. Outside, the world had turned to a sea of white. Trees drooped under thick blankets of snow, and the roof of the old shed had collapsed entirely under the weight. Sunlight pushed through the clouds, for the first time in days, casting glittering reflections off every branch and drift. Jack stood at the cabin's front door, coffee in hand, marveling at how silence after a storm could be so profound. He hadn't realized just how loud his solitude had been until the bears arrived. Inside the storage room, the cubs were awake. Both were walking now, still slow, still clumsy, but curious and alive. The mother sat upright, eyes alert but not hostile. When Jack came to the window, she didn't flinch. He placed a fresh bowl of food outside the door, boiled potatoes and oatmeal with some melted butter. They devoured it. Later, he would write in his journal, "I broke every rule I ever lived by, and somehow everything feels more right than it ever has." By the fourth morning, Jack no longer thought of the storage room as a shed or utility space. It had become something else entirely. A refuge. A sanctuary. A place that, like him, was never meant to carry life but somehow had found purpose in doing so. The snow had stopped falling, but it hadn't melted. The temperatures remained punishing, and the sunlight that pierced the sky did little to warm the land. Outside, the trees groaned under the weight of their frozen coats, and the only sign of life in the entire valley was what pulsed in that back room. The cubs were growing stronger. Every day they moved more, explored more, acted less like survivors and more like, well, children. Jack had begun naming them in his mind, though he never said the names aloud. The smaller one, the cautious one, he called Twig, delicate but resilient. The bigger, more curious cub was Nudge, always poking at things, testing boundaries, nibbling at corners of old tarps or pawing gently at the heater's base. And the mother? He hadn't dared give her a name. She wasn't his. She wasn't tame. She was a force, wild and weather-worn and patient in a way few humans were capable of being. She had not only survived, she had protected. And to Jack, that demanded a reverence no name could satisfy. That morning, the food supply had run low. Jack stood in the kitchen inventorying what remained. His shelves were stocked for one man, for one winter, not 3 bears, even if 2 of them were miniature. He had rice, canned beans, oats, and powdered soup. A few bags of trail mix. If the bears stayed longer, he'd have to ration with precision. Still, he didn't regret it. Not one bit. He boiled oats, added melted lard and softened apples, and prepared a bowl just like he had the past 2 mornings. The difference today? He didn't leave it outside the storage door. He walked in with it. The second he entered, the warmth met him like a slow breath. The heater hummed steadily. Snowmelt pooled near the doorway from thawed boots and tracked fur. The air smelled earthy and alive. The cubs were awake. Nudge stood near a stack of gear cases, sniffing the corner of a sleeping bag. Twig lay curled under the mother's chin, blinking sleepily. The mother lifted her head at Jack's entrance, her gaze sweeping him like a searchlight. Jack crouched low, bowl in hand, and set it gently down on a folded towel halfway between the door and the heater. "I brought breakfast," he said softly. "Figured we're past the room service at the door phase." She didn't react at first. She only stared. Jack remained still, breathing through his nose, letting the moment pass without tension. The cubs didn't seem afraid, just curious. After nearly a full minute, Nudge padded forward, cautious but emboldened by routine. He reached the bowl, sniffed it, and began eating in small bites. The mother watched him go, but she didn't stop him. That was the shift. The trust, once balanced on a thread, had moved slightly. No longer just survival, it was coexistence. Jack backed out slowly, closed the door, and leaned against the hallway wall. His breath came fast and shaky. He hadn't even realized how tense he'd been until the moment passed. But he was grinning now, head tilted back, heart hammering in that strange mixture of fear and joy that only comes when you risk something you can't afford to lose. He made coffee. Real coffee, the last scoop of it, and sat at the table flipping through an old sketch pad. His wife had drawn in it long ago. Scribbles of bears and trees and her silly cabin blueprints from when they used to daydream about building a retreat together. She'd drawn one page full of bear paws with smiling faces. Now Jack traced one with his finger and whispered, "You'd like them." Later that afternoon, the power flickered. It was subtle at first. A hiccup in the heater hum, A twitch in the overhead light, but Jack knew what it meant. He bundled up immediately and headed outside. The sky had cleared, the snow reflecting so brightly it made his eyes water. The generator sat half-buried under a drift, its hum dull and uneven. He worked fast, shoveling around it, checking the intake valves and clearing the ice that had begun to form on the intake. The line running to the cabin sputtered with cold strain. He wrapped it tighter, re-insulated what he could, and prayed it would hold. Half an hour in, he could barely feel his fingers. He forced himself to keep going, ignoring the frostbite warnings his brain kept shouting. When the work was done, and the power stabilized, he stumbled back inside, peeled off his gloves, and stuck his hands directly near the fire. Pain returned in hot, searing waves. It made him groan aloud. That night, as he sat nursing his fingers and sipping broth, he heard something. Movement. From the back room, he turned slowly, listening. The soft sound of claws clicking on wood, padding footsteps. Then, the faintest whine. Jack rose and walked to the storage room window. Nudge was at the door. He wasn't scared. He wasn't clawing. He was curious. Jack opened the inner door slowly. Nudge backed away a step, blinking up at him. "Just saying hi, huh?" Jack said gently. From her corner, the mother lifted her head. She watched, but didn't rise. Her breathing was calm. Jack crouched and sat just outside the doorframe. The cub came a little closer. Jack reached out, resting his hand palm up on the floor. Nudge sniffed the air, then inched forward, nose twitching. He didn't touch him, but he got close. That was enough. Jack smiled, eyes stinging. Not from the cold this time. They were building something here. Something real. Something worth breaking the rules for. Morning broke, with pale sunlight brushing against the frost-coated windows like shy fingers knocking gently. Jack was already up, sitting at the small kitchen table, scribbling in his notebook between sips of hot tea. His fingers were bandaged and sore, but functional, just a brush with first-degree frostbite. He'd gotten lucky, again. But the generator was holding, and the bears were still alive. He didn't go to the back room immediately. Instead, he sat with the moment, listened to the quiet hum of his cabin, and reflected on how quickly things had changed. In just a few days, his world had expanded again, cracked open by 3 creatures who didn't ask to be saved, but had been anyway. And in doing so, they'd begun saving him too. Jack finally rose, feeling the stiffness in his joints from too many nights sleeping in the living room near the fire. He walked to the storage room door, hand on the knob, paused a second longer than usual, then opened it quietly. Warmth met him. Nudge was the first to lift his head. His eyes were clearer now, movement more confident. He stood and stretched clumsily, then padded over to the heater, curling up beside it like it had always belonged to him. Twig followed more hesitantly, but she too had regained strength. She moved with slow but deliberate steps, nestling under her brother's side. The mother bear remained in the corner, upright but not threatening. Her coat still bore patches of frozen dirt from when she'd collapsed in the snow, but the sheen of life had returned to her eyes. She blinked at Jack with a calm that was neither submissive nor confrontational. It was something more powerful. Recognition. Jack crouched slowly and placed 2 bowls near the doorway, one with soaked oats and beef broth, another with warm water. The cubs approached first, their trust now unspoken. They ate in slow, contented mouthfuls. The mother did not join them, but she didn't stop them either. It wasn't hunger holding her back. It was something else. Jack stayed a few more minutes before backing out of the room and closing the door gently. His heart, despite the healing peace in that room, carried a growing heaviness. He was running out of time. Not just supplies, but certainty. How long could he keep them here? How long before instinct returned and shattered this fragile peace? When the weather warmed, when their strength returned, what then? And yet, what was the alternative? To rush them out into a world still cloaked in snow and silence? He shook the thoughts from his head and returned to his tea, but unease hung around his shoulders like another layer of frost. That afternoon, the first sound of real trouble broke the rhythm. A cry, high-pitched, sharp. A cub's voice. Jack bolted up and ran to the back. He opened the door just in time to see Twig stagger away from the heater, her legs stuck between two stacked crates. She tried to climb, likely curious, and slipped. Her small form trembled, whimpering in pain. Before Jack could move, the mother bear surged to her feet. For a moment, everything froze. The air went thick with tension. Jack's body braced out of sheer instinct, his heart thundering in his chest. The mother stood tall, ears back, muscles coiled. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply held her gaze. Then slowly, agonizingly slowly, he dropped to his knees. Still staring into her eyes, he raised both hands, palms up, and whispered, "Let me help." The silence roared louder than any storm. The cub whimpered again. The mother turned her head, just slightly, toward her injured baby, then back at Jack. And she stepped aside. One step. It was all he needed. Jack crawled forward, his every breath deliberate, controlled. Twig's leg was caught, twisted in a way that could do serious damage if pulled wrong. He studied the position, shifted the crate carefully, and after a tense moment, lifted the cub's tiny limb free. Twig cried once more, then nestled against his leg in a quivering heap. Jack's chest tightened. The mother let out a sound, low, guttural, but not angry. It was almost encouraging. He gently placed Twig near her brother and backed away, never turning his back to the mother. Once at the door he stood, chest tight with adrenaline. He closed the door, leaned against it, and let out a long, shaky breath. Holy hell! That night, he didn't sleep at all. He stared at the ceiling, hands folded behind his head, replaying the moment 1,000 times. Not because he was afraid, because he couldn't believe it had happened. A mother bear had allowed him to touch her cub. Not once, in all his years photographing wildlife, had he witnessed anything close to that. Trust like that wasn't earned through food. It wasn't given easily. It was something deeper, something primal, something forged through shared desperation and survival. The next day, the mother bear limped slightly when she walked. Jack noticed immediately her right foreleg dragged just a bit more than usual. She had exhausted herself keeping her cubs alive. Every breath she took, every step, was a cost. But she never once stopped watching them. Even as they grew stronger, climbed, tumbled, sniffed at the walls, she remained their protector, their guardian. Her eyes followed, her body shifted, her ears twitched. She was still fighting, even as the worst had passed. And Jack felt it in his bones, the same feeling he'd had when he sat beside his wife's hospital bed, watching her squeeze his hand between chemo treatments, whispering, "I just want to know you'll be okay." Back then, he hadn't had an answer. Now, he was the one watching over someone else's world. And this time, he wasn't running. That evening, just before dusk, Jack opened the inner window to the storage room and did something he hadn't done in years. He picked up his camera. The viewfinder framed the mother bear and her cubs as they lay in a patch of fading sunlight on the floor, bodies pressed together, fur warmed by fire and survival. It was a quiet moment, a sacred one. He didn't take the photo. Not yet. But he looked through the lens, hand steady, eyes damp. "I get it now," he whispered. Strength isn't about standing alone. He lowered the camera, folded his arms on the sill, and just watched them sleep. The night air settled in like a heavy blanket, thick, still, and far colder than it should have been for a day after sunlight. Jack felt it creeping in through the cabin walls, whispering across the wooden planks like a warning not to let his guard down. The storm had passed, yes, but winter in Alaska was never done so easily. And that night would prove it. He sat beside the fireplace, a fresh stack of logs burning steadily, but the heat no longer reached the far corners of the room. He could feel the cold creeping in again. Something had shifted. He stood, crossed to the window, and peeked out into the darkness. No wind, no snow, no stars. That was the first bad sign. He went to the storage room door and pressed his ear to it. Silence. Not even the sound of cubs breathing, shuffling, or the soft thumps of paws. It was too quiet. He cracked the door open. Warm air spilled out like a whisper of relief. The heater still hummed. The cubs were curled together, eyes closed, moving in their sleep. But the mother bear's head lifted as soon as Jack entered. Her eyes met his, calm, steady. He nodded. She blinked. Then she slowly lowered her head again, pressing it against her cubs. Jack smiled faintly. He didn't linger. Back in the main room, he poured a small mug of broth, added salt, and drank it slowly. His body was exhausted, but his mind wouldn't settle. It kept circling back to small details, the way the heater had sputtered earlier that afternoon, the subtle flicker of the lights before dusk, the way the temperature outside was dropping faster than the forecast had warned. He decided to check the generator again. Bundling up, he stepped into the cold. His boots crunched through snow that had frozen over, a crusty sheen now covering everything. The generator sat beneath the lean-to out back, its red casing nearly lost under a blanket of white. As he approached, he noticed the hum was off. It wasn't the normal, steady purr he'd grown used to. It was a stuttering sound, uneven, gasping. He opened the panel. His breath caught. The fuel line had a hairline crack. It had likely formed during the deep freeze. A single fracture in the rubber tubing. It hadn't failed yet, but it would. And if it did, the heater in the storage room would die. The room would lose warmth. And the bears, still fragile, still dependent on the heat, would be back in danger. "Damn it!" Jack muttered, his gloved hands already fumbling for the tool bag. He didn't have a replacement tube, not one made for fuel lines. But he did have heavy-duty duct tape, sealant, and the knowledge of a man who had lived far too long depending on the unreliable. The repair was makeshift, ugly, and temporary, but it would hold, at least for tonight. He returned inside with stiff fingers and snow-drenched pants. He stripped by the door, left his boots on the mat, and returned to the fire, sighing deeply. It was close. Too close. He looked at the photo of the mother grizzly on the wall, the one from years ago. The mother in the river, cubs riding her back through the mist. Then he turned towards the storage room door. This mother hadn't carried her cubs across water. She had carried them through death itself. Back in the storage room, the air had thinned. The heater, while still on, didn't seem to have the same power behind it. Jack opened the door wider, let some of the heat from the main cabin flow in. The cubs stirred slightly. The mother lifted her head, her nostrils flaring faintly. He crouched at the edge of the room, watching her as she blinked slowly. "You held them through worse," he murmured. "You won't lose them now." He stayed for a while, sitting on the floor just outside the room, watching her as she drifted back into sleep. The cubs pressed into her side. Her body curled tighter, a living wall of fur and breath. Hours passed. Sometime after midnight, a new sound jolted Jack awake. Click, whir, choke. The heater had stopped. He rushed to the storage room. The generator hadn't failed, but the heater itself had overrun, maybe clogged, maybe just worn out. It was nearly 2 a.m. The cold would return fast. Jack made a decision without thinking. He grabbed every wool blanket he had, dragged them into the storage room, and layered them against the walls and floor, trapping in what heat remained. Then he took a steel kettle of water, heated it on the fire until it boiled, poured it into his backup canteen, wrapped it in cloth, and placed it just behind the cubs where the heater had sat. The mother didn't stir. But when he touched her cubs, gently shifting the warmth into place, her eyes fluttered open. She looked at him, exhausted, silent, and then something happened that sent a tremor through Jack's chest. She reached her massive paw toward the cubs and tucked them tighter beneath her body, without breaking eye contact with him. It wasn't a threat. It was a gesture of shared purpose. "I see what you're doing. I'm still here too." Jack exhaled and sank to the floor, too tired to leave the room. For the first time, he didn't close the door behind him. He slept beside them. Not close, but not far either. In that warm makeshift den of man and beast, life held on. And Jack, who had spent years running from loss, finally felt what it meant to stand with it, to shoulder it, to protect something again. Outside, the stars broke through the cloud cover. The trees stopped groaning. The world, for just one night, was still. The morning light spilled into the cabin like gold poured across glass, delicate, silent, almost sacred. Jack opened his eyes to a room that no longer felt cold or broken. His back ached from sleeping on the wooden floor, one blanket beneath him, another draped over his shoulders, but his first thought wasn't about his pain. It was about them. He turned his head toward the far end of the storage room. The makeshift shelter of blankets and soft layers still held its shape, and nestled within it were the cubs, curled together like two furred commas in sleep. Their small chests rose and fell in perfect unison. And beside them, the mother bear lay still, but not limp. Her head was raised slightly, her eyes open and calm. She looked at Jack. Not startled, not guarded, simply present. It was the most peaceful look she had given him yet. Jack sat up slowly, careful not to startle her. His muscles groaned in protest, and he stretched his arms overhead, wincing. It was the kind of full-body stiffness that made him feel like every year he'd lived was asking to be remembered. He rose to his feet, still wrapped in the wool blanket, and walked to the doorway. "You made it through," he whispered, voice husky. She blinked once. In the kitchen, Jack made breakfast the way he had every day for the past week. Oats, broth, a soft apple diced into tiny chunks, a little salt. He placed a bowl near the storage room door again, but this time he didn't even need to back away. One of the cubs, Nudge, ambled forward almost as soon as he smelled it, tugging the bowl backward with his teeth. Twig followed more slowly, nudging him aside to take her share. The mother bear watched, but didn't intervene. The food had become routine. The human had become something more than a shadow. Jack had no word for what he was to her now. Not friend. Not threat. Just necessary. But there was something new growing beneath that word. By noon, he found himself standing outside, shovel in hand, clearing a path to the old woodshed. The snow had frozen into layers of glass, and each scoop echoed like a chisel-splitting stone. His hands, wrapped in thick gloves, still stung from the cold. But it was necessary. If the heater failed again, he needed more options. More fuel, more insulation, more backup. The work kept his mind focused, but inside it all, a storm brewed. He couldn't keep them much longer. It wasn't just the logistics, though food was running low, and his power supply was increasingly fragile. It was instinct. He could see it in the cubs, their strength returning, their play becoming more assertive. Yesterday, Nudge had climbed onto an overturned milk crate and tried to leap onto a hanging rope. He'd fallen, clumsily. But the point was clear. He was ready to move again. And so was their mother. Her limp was less noticeable now. She moved with slow, deliberate steps, but the weakness was fading. She had started standing near the back door of the storage room, sniffing at the cracks between wood panels, catching the scent of the trees just beyond. Wildness was calling again. The den had done its job. Now it was time for the world to take them back. That night, Jack didn't light the fire. He watched the cubs from the inner window instead, sipping hot water as the stars pierced the sky like pinpricks in velvet. For the first time, he let the camera rest on his lap, not lifted to his face, just held like a memory. The mother bear was grooming one of the cubs. She licked gently at the matted fur along his back, while the other dozed, twitching in sleep. There was something almost meditative about it. The rhythm, the care. Jack swallowed hard. "You're better now," he whispered. The next morning the sun returned fully, not just light, but warmth. The cabin walls creaked and groaned as the frost began to melt, and water dripped from the eaves in slow, steady trickles. Outside, the snow had softened, and dark patches of earth peeked through along the edges of the pines. Jack took it as a sign. He spent the next few hours preparing. First, he checked the fuel reserves, enough to run the generator for another 5, maybe 6 days. Then he took inventory of food. Not much left. A few cans, some rice, a little jerky. Enough for him, not enough for 3 bears. Then he pulled a dusty box from under the bed. Inside it were old harnesses, canvas bags, climbing rope, and a pair of rusted bear bells from a camping trip with his wife. He smiled faintly, holding them up. The bells had always annoyed her. "They sound like Christmas in a nightmare," she joked. But Jack had brought them anyway, claiming they gave him peace of mind. Today, they gave him something else: closure. He clipped one bell to a strip of paracord and tied it near the back entrance to the storage room, where it dangled gently in the light breeze. Not to scare the bears. To signal. To offer them choice. He opened the back door slowly, letting the scent of fresh pine and thawing earth sweep into the warm room. The cubs stirred immediately. The mother's ears twitched. Jack stepped aside and waited. The moment stretched long. Then the mother bear rose. She walked to the threshold, paused, and sniffed the air. Her body filled the frame of the open door like a painting, massive, dark, beautiful. She didn't step out. But she didn't retreat either. Her cubs followed, wobbling with excitement, sniffing the cold boards, squinting at the sudden light. Jack said nothing. He simply stood there, a respectful distance away, heart full of weight he didn't know how to set down. The mother turned her head and looked at him. And for the first time since the night she collapsed on his porch, she made a sound. Not a growl, not a warning. A low, almost imperceptible chuff. A breath. Then she turned back toward the door and stepped out. The cubs followed. Jack didn't move. He just watched them disappear into the light. The stillness that followed the bear's departure felt unnatural, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. Jack stood in the open doorway, the early morning light stretching long shadows across the snow-thinned yard. In the distance, he could just make out the prints they left, massive paws, little imprints, a trail weaving between the trees like a path back to something ancient and free. They didn't look back. That part stung more than he expected. He closed the door quietly, almost reverently, as if not to disturb the memory hanging in the air. The cabin, once a haven for silence, now echoed with absence. For days, his life had revolved around those 3 creatures, his routine molded to their needs, his fears redirected, his heart softened. Now it was just him again. And the quiet, returning like an old burden settling back onto his shoulders. Jack walked into the storage room and stood at the center, staring around at what was left. Fur in the corners, scratches in the floor, the scent of pine needles and musk still clinging to the blankets and walls. A strange energy lingered, like a fading warmth in a room just vacated. He reached down and picked up one of the silver emergency blankets, crumpled, torn at the edges where claws had caught. He folded it slowly, methodically, then placed it into a bin labelled Field Supplies. He'd sort the rest later. What struck him most was how hard it was to let go. He hadn't realized until now just how much he'd needed them. Not just to care for, but to feel again, to matter again. That night, sleep did not come easily. He kept the fire burning longer than necessary, the sound of the logs crackling too similar to the rustling of fur and paws in the other room. He caught himself turning his head every time a branch snapped outside, thinking maybe, just maybe, they'd return. But they didn't. And deep down, he didn't expect them to. Wildness, once restored, doesn't look back. The next few days passed in the kind of rhythm Jack had almost forgotten. Empty, predictable, punctuated by chores and silence. He refilled the woodpile, repaired the section of fence blown down by the last storm, and even cleared the path to the old trailhead that hadn't seen bootprints in months. But there was something else happening, too. Something quiet and internal. Jack began to remember again. Not just the bears, but what came before them. His wife's laughter as she splashed across a creek in thigh-high waders. The way she used to trace his jaw when he edited photos late into the night. The way she used to hum when she cooked terrible songs from the 80s that somehow made everything taste better. For the first time since her death, those memories didn't feel like weights dragging him underwater. They felt like breath. One evening, while sorting through his old gear in the storage room, Jack found the box she had labelled, "Open when you're lost." He'd never dared to. Never felt brave enough to confront whatever was inside. But now, he pulled the tape, lifted the lid. Inside, a notebook and a photograph. Not of a bear, not of the two of them, but of a small bird perched on her finger. There was something childlike in her grin, her eyes crinkled at the corners. He could practically hear her voice in the moment, probably some joke about being a wilderness princess. Jack chuckled softly. Beneath the photo was a short letter, handwritten. "You always said you'd go quiet when I left. Disappear. Shrink into silence. I hope you didn't. But just in case, here's my reminder. Kindness is louder than grief. Keep choosing it, no matter how cold it gets. Love always. L." He didn't cry. Not right away. He just sat there, hands trembling around the letter, eyes closed, letting the silence carry her words deeper into him than they'd ever gone. Later that night, he picked up his camera for real. Not as a relic, not as something to hold for comfort, but as the tool it had always been, a way to speak without saying a word. He stepped outside and started taking pictures again. The light through the frost-covered branches, the delicate print of a rabbit in newly fallen snow, the slow, quiet melt happening along the edge of the stream where the ice had finally cracked open. Each photo was a small truth. Each shutter click a breath of life. A few days later, Jack stood at the edge of a bluff overlooking the valley. The sky above was ablaze with 1,000 stars, but he wasn't looking at the heavens. He was scanning the tree line. And there, faint, far away, movement. A bear. Larger now, stronger in its step. And behind it, two smaller shapes, no longer stumbling but running, playing. He lifted the camera. Not to capture them, just to see. Through the viewfinder, the mother paused at the edge of the trees. She looked across the valley, not directly at him, but close enough. Jack didn't lift a hand, didn't speak. He just watched. And after a moment, the bear turned back into the forest, her cubs following like shadows returning home. He lowered the camera and stood in the stillness. Not broken, not empty, just changed. Jack lingered at the bluff longer than he meant to, the memory of those three silhouettes dancing behind his eyes even after they had vanished into the trees. A part of him remained rooted to that spot, reluctant to return to the cabin and its familiar quiet. But another part, the part that had felt something spark, awake, when the cubs tugged at his sleeves, when the mother bear let him close, knew this was not the end. It was a beginning. He made his way back home slowly, the camera slung over his shoulder like a companion rediscovered. The snow was beginning to break in earnest now, revealing the soft brown shoulders of the land beneath. Water trickled in steady rivulets through the forest floor, pooling at the base of trees like offerings. A silence of a different kind had taken over, not the silence of isolation, but the hush that comes after survival. When he stepped into the cabin, it smelled of wood smoke, drying pine, and something warmer, something lived in. The storage room was empty now. He had cleaned it completely, swept out the straw and fur, packed away the blankets and makeshift bedding, but the air still held the essence of what had taken place there. He could feel it in his chest, in his bones, a place where something miraculous had happened and passed through him like wind through open doors. He sat by the fire and stared into the flames. Time moved differently now, not slower, but clearer. He didn't think about the past with bitterness or dread. He didn't think about the future with fear. He was simply here. And then the rock slide. It happened 4 days later, without warning. Jack had driven into town for supplies, a rare journey down the mountain road in his aging pickup. The snow had melted enough for passage, and he had promised himself a hot coffee from the old diner and a restock on oats, beans, and jerky. He hadn't intended to stay long. He had just started the drive back, his truck rattling along the gravel path, hemmed in by rising cliffs and old birch. The world was green now, or at least trying to be. Buds lined the tree branches. Birds fluttered overhead. Then, without warning, his breath caught. A figure stood in the middle of the road. Massive. Solid. Unmoving. It was her, the mother bear. She stood facing him, eyes sharp, posture unreadable. Her fur was thicker now, darker, with a healthy sheen that hadn't been there before. There was no aggression in her stance. But she didn't move either. Jack slammed the brakes. The truck skidded to a halt just meters from her massive form. He gripped the wheel tightly, heart thundering, not from fear but disbelief. He hadn't expected to see her again, not like this. Not standing in the middle of the road as if waiting. "What?" he whispered, breath fogging the windshield. And then the earth trembled. It started subtle, just enough to rattle the rearview mirror. Then the shaking grew, rising like a low growl from the base of the mountain. A second later, a deafening crack filled the valley. Jack's eyes snapped forward just as a massive section of the cliff ahead began to crumble. Rocks the size of boulders crashed onto the road he would have been driving on within seconds. Dust exploded into the air, trees snapped like twigs, and the path disappeared under tons of debris. The bear hadn't moved. She'd stopped him. She'd known. The truck's engine stuttered in the silence that followed the collapse, its low idle the only sound competing with the beating in Jack's ears. He looked back up, breath-catching. The bear turned her head, looked toward the forest, and then back at him. There, at the edge of the trees, two smaller shapes emerged. The cubs, no longer weak, no longer fragile. They stood tall and curious, their coats full, their bodies strong. They looked at Jack with something that almost resembled recognition. Then the mother bear let out a low chuff, gentle, final. She turned toward the woods. The cubs followed. Before vanishing into the trees, the mother paused, just for a moment, her head turned, her eyes finding Jack one last time. No growl, no roar, just a moment of stillness. Then she was gone. Jack sat in his truck, staring at the pile of boulders that had obliterated the road. If he had left 5 seconds earlier, or if she hadn't stopped him, he wouldn't be alive. He leaned back in the seat, overwhelmed, heart pounding. "You saved me," he whispered. His fingers found the camera again. He didn't take a picture. Not this time. Some things, he now understood, weren't meant to be captured. They were meant to be carried. It took hours to find another way back. The longer road was rougher, more winding, and forced him to ford a narrow creek. But it didn't matter. Every bump and rattle reminded him of where he'd been and who he owed his life to. When he finally reached the cabin again, it felt different. Larger, warmer, filled with something unseen. He walked inside, set the supplies down, and paused. The fire hadn't been lit, but the room still felt full. He looked around and realized he was smiling, not because the danger had passed, but because he wasn't alone anymore. Not really. Jack stood at the cabin's porch the next morning, coffee in hand, watching as the sun rose over the distant ridgeline. The mountains glowed gold and rose pink, shadows stretching out long across the valley. Snow still clung to the edges of the trees, but most of the land had awakened, spring pushing in around the edges like a shy guest. But what struck Jack most wasn't the beauty of it. It was the stillness. This stillness no longer felt lonely. It felt earned. He leaned against the railing, letting the steam from the mug warm his face, and exhaled long and slow. The events of the past week still pulsed in his chest like the echoes of a bell. The mother bear, the cubs, the storm, the storage room, the rock slide, the impossible fact that she had saved him, that somehow a wild animal had remembered and had acted. Not out of instinct, not hunger, not fear, but memory, recognition, trust. He couldn't explain it. Didn't need to. It had happened. He carried it with him now, not as a story to tell, but as a truth stitched into the quiet fabric of his life. Back inside, he lit the fire, unpacked the dry goods, and filled the pantry. The cabin had been a place of survival for so long. Now it felt like a place of living. There was a difference. A profound one. Later, he pulled out his camera again. Not for documentation this time, but for purpose. He had an idea. A project. One he'd avoided since leaving Seattle. One he'd once dreamed of doing with his wife. A series not just of wildlife, but of moments between worlds. Encounters. He began by photographing what remained. The scratched floorboards of the storage room. The wool blankets still bearing paw-shaped impressions. The trees just beyond the tree line where the family had vanished. He moved with reverence, with memory guiding his eye, and for the first time in years, the shutter felt like an extension of his breath, not just a machine in his hand. By dusk, he had filled a memory card. He sat down at his work table, uploaded the images, and stared at the screen. One, in particular, stopped him. A shot of the empty storage room, sunlight falling across the floor in a golden beam. No bears, no food, no heater, just light and space. But in the dust, faint and almost unnoticeable, were 3 sets of footprints, frozen in time. Jack stared at it, tears stinging his eyes, and whispered, "That's the one." He printed it. Not large, just enough to pin beside the photo of the bear in the river. 2 mothers, 2 moments, both sacred. That night, as the fire cracked and the moon rose, he began to write. Not in his notebook this time, but a letter. To a friend in Seattle, a former editor, long retired, who had once offered him a chance at a gallery show. He hadn't replied then. Now he did. "They came to my door," he wrote. "I opened it. I didn't know what would happen. I thought I was saving them. Maybe I did. But it's clearer now they saved me too. I've begun working again, and I think I'm ready to show the world what that looks like." He signed it simply, J.F. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. The land continued to thaw. Trees budded, creeks swelled, birds returned in numbers Jack hadn't seen in years. Life moved forward. But Jack kept looking back. Not in regret, just in hope. Hope that maybe one day he might see them again. And then, on a warm evening in May, as he stood by the open shed sorting through tools, he felt a shift in the air. A sound. Not a warning. Not a threat. A chuff. Soft. Familiar. He turned, heart caught in his throat. At the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the golden light, stood the mother bear. Alone. She didn't come forward, didn't move past the shadows. She just stood there, watching. Jack didn't step closer. He didn't raise his voice. He only offered a small, slow nod. Their eyes met again. No longer strangers. No longer desperate. Equals. And then she turned. Vanished. Jack let the moment settle in his bones like warmth into wood. He didn't chase it. He didn't need to. She was where she belonged now. And so was he. That night, he made tea instead of coffee. Lit the fire, not because of the cold, but because he liked the sound. And he sat with the photo of the footprints, letting it speak for itself. He knew what he had to do next. It was time to open the world back up. Not just with a door, but with a story. The gallery invitation came on a rainy morning in June. Unexpected, understated, and addressed in the familiar scrawl of someone who hadn't written to him in years. "We'd love to host your work, Jack. The theme, Connections in the Wild, suits what you described. We're reserving a wall for your project. The world's been quiet too long. Time we heard from you again." There was no sales pitch, no fanfare. Just that quiet affirmation Jack hadn't realized he'd been waiting for. He set the letter down on the counter, rain still drumming gently on the metal roof above, and walked to the storage room. The door creaked slightly as it opened. It was spotless now, repurposed as a workspace. The heater had been removed, but one of the wool blankets remained, folded in the corner like a relic. On the wall, above the makeshift desk, were 6 photographs printed in soft matte black and white. All of them were traces, not faces. A paw print, pressed into snow. A cub's tiny claw hooked on a woolen thread. The blur of fur and motion beside a beam of morning light. He didn't photograph them directly, not while they were under his care. That had never felt right. This series wasn't about ownership. It was about witnessing. And now, the world would witness too. He spent the next several days preparing his submission, scanning, resizing, printing, writing captions that were more like quiet journal entries than descriptions. He didn't try to be profound, just honest. Somewhere in the silence, they taught me how to listen again. I opened the door. They walked in. I never closed it again. She didn't need to growl. I heard everything in her eyes. Each word came easier than he expected. The night before his planned trip back to the city, Jack couldn't sleep. He lay on the couch with his head resting against an old pillow, the fire casting shadows across the ceiling, and watched the flames like they were telling stories. He thought about all the doors he'd closed in the years since his wife passed. Not physical ones, but emotional. Doors to memory, doors to risk, doors to connection. It had taken a blizzard and 3 dying animals to show him how much life was still waiting. The next morning, he packed the truck. Gear, prints, notebook, a small cooler of food. He locked the cabin, checked the generator one last time, and began the winding descent down the mountain road, heart equal parts heavy and full. Halfway down the trail, where the narrow pass curved hard against the rock wall, Jack slowed. His foot eased off the gas without even thinking. The site of the rock slide had been cleared now. Rangers and local crews had moved the rubble weeks earlier, but the memory was stronger than the silence. He brought the truck to a stop, got out, and walked. The cliff face above still bore the scars of the fall. Deep gashes, broken roots, a hanging ledge that looked like it could still come loose if prodded the wrong way. He stood there a long moment, hand resting on the hood of the truck, eyes scanning the rock. He wasn't looking for damage. He was looking for her. He didn't expect to see her, not really, but he felt her there, or rather, he felt the echo of her presence, how she had stood right there in the middle of the road, risking everything to stop him. It hadn't been a coincidence. It had been a choice. And that truth stayed with him as he drove on. The gallery was quiet when he arrived 2 days later. An old brick building tucked along the edge of a modest Seattle street, far from the glitzy downtown exhibitions. Just the way Jack liked it. Familiar. Modest. Human. His former editor met him at the door, a tall man with white in his beard and the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much, but still believed in moments. They hugged without words. Inside, the gallery was all clean white walls and gentle lighting. As Jack walked through the space reserved for his work, he felt a strange swell in his chest. Not pride, exactly, something deeper. Validation. Not from the art. From what the art came from? The wall featured 9 prints. In the center, his favorite. The photo of the empty room, sunlight falling across the floor, footprints trailing off toward a door cracked open. Below it, a small caption. Some doors should never be closed. When the gallery opened to the public a week later, Jack stood in a corner, hat pulled low, hands in his jacket pockets, and watched. People stopped. They didn't just glance. They lingered. Some tilted their heads. Some took photos. Some, surprisingly, cried. He didn't speak to many of them. Didn't need to. But one woman approached, middle-aged, freckles, kind eyes. "Did you take these?" she asked softly. Jack nodded. She looked at the footprints photo, then back at him. "They're not just animals, are they?" Jack hesitated. "No," he said. "They were family. Just for a while." She smiled. "That's enough." That night, after the gallery closed, Jack stood alone before the display. The lights dimmed, the streetlights outside casting long beams through the tall windows. He looked at the photo of the prince one more time and let the silence answer every question he still carried. And then he turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. But this time, he didn't lock it. Summer arrived quietly in the valley. The sun now rose early and strong, melting away the last hidden patches of snow beneath the trees. Streams flowed freely again, carving through earth that had remained frozen for months. The woods were alive with the chatter of birds and the buzz of insects. Everything was in motion, reborn. Jack's truck crunched over the gravel path as he returned to the cabin, dust trailing behind him. It had been 2 weeks since the gallery opening, and the city already felt like a different world. He'd never belonged to that rhythm, not even in his prime. The honking, the crowds, the endless rush. It had felt hollow compared to the quiet breath of the forest and the sacred stillness of his porch at dawn. He parked beside the cabin and just sat for a moment, staring at the familiar structure, the logs, the smoke-blackened chimney, The crooked porch railing he never quite got around to fixing. It felt like coming home from a war he hadn't known he was fighting. Jack stepped out into the warm mountain air, his boots crunching the dry ground. Birds scattered from a nearby bush. He paused to take it in. The peace, the rhythm, the way the wind moved differently here. Slower, more deliberate. Inside, the cabin had remained as he left it. The scent of wood smoke and pine still clung to the walls. A faint layer of dust coated the mantel. He walked through the rooms slowly, brushing his hand over the old furniture, the books, the coffee mug that still sat in the drying rack. And then he reached the storage room. He hesitated, hand on the door frame, then opened it. The room had changed since the bears left. He had added a small desk, repurposed the wall into a display for his best wildlife prints, and installed a shelf with old camera gear he'd recently cleaned and restored. A pinewood box sat in the corner, filled with sketches and letters. But the core of the room, the memory, was untouched. On the far wall hung the single photograph he could never look at too long. The footprint image, sun filtering in through the window, 3 sets of prints trailing into the light. He stood before it now, hand resting gently against the edge of the frame. "I don't know if you'll come back," he whispered, voice low and uneven. "But the door's open." He kept it that way, literally. The back door, the one the bears had first entered through, he left unlatched that evening. He set a small bowl of water by the step. Not bait, not an invitation. Just remembrance. He sat on the porch until dark, the stars dusting the sky in quiet celebration. He didn't speak, didn't move much. He just listened. To the crickets, the rustling of the trees, the faint trickle of the creek below. The wilderness didn't thank you with words, but it did speak. And that night, it said, "You belong here, again." The following morning, he awoke before dawn and brewed tea, the cabin warm and glowing with the soft orange hues of firelight. He stepped outside just as the sun cracked the horizon, and froze. At the tree line, barely visible through the early mist, a single shape stood watching. A bear, larger now. Muscles defined, coat thick and clean. She didn't move. She simply stood there, like she always had, silent, unshaken, ancient. Jack stepped off the porch, slowly. Not close, but just enough to be seen. The morning light painted him in gold and shadow. He raised a hand, not waving, just present. 2 more shapes stepped from the mist behind her. The cubs. No longer cubs, not really. Teenagers in bear years. Bigger, stronger. They followed her but didn't cling. They walked side by side, tall and proud. The mother looked at Jack, just for a heartbeat, then gave a small, low chuff. He knew that sound. He would never forget it. She turned and moved back into the forest, her young ones flanking her. In seconds, they were gone. No dramatic exit. No grand gesture. Just a return to the wild, as it should be. Jack stood there, long after they disappeared, heart full in a way it hadn't been since he couldn't remember. He turned his gaze toward the sky. His wife would have laughed. She would have wrapped her arms around him and said, "See? Even grizzlies recognize good people." He smiled. And this time, it didn't feel bittersweet. It just felt right. That afternoon, he sat at the storage room desk, notebook open, camera beside him, tea cooling by his hand. He wrote 3 words at the top of the page. Chapter 1 begins. Because it wasn't the end. Not for him. Not for them. The storm had come. The wild had tested them all. And in choosing each other, in defying instinct and fear, something beautiful had survived. Jack would never close his door the same way again. Not in winter. Not in grief. Not in life. And somewhere, Deep in the Alaskan wilderness, 3 bears walked the forest floor stronger than before, carrying the warmth of a man's fire in their memory, and a piece of his heart with every step.